The badge and the bench. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that weighed on the air, thick with tension and anticipation. Judge Ayanna Carter sat tall behind the bench, her gaze locked on the man standing in front of her. The nameplate on her desk gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but the power she held had nothing to do with the polished wood or the robe draped over her shoulders. It was in her voice, her presence, and the undeniable authority in her eyes. Across the room, Officer Greg Mathers smirked. He had walked into this courtroom like he always did, like he owned the place, like his badge was a shield, a golden ticket that had kept him safe from consequence for over 2 decades. Today was supposed to be no different, but it was, because today he wasn't standing in court as an officer of the law. He was here as the accused. The case had been making waves across the city. It wasn't just another instance of excessive force. It was the moment the system was being forced to answer for itself. Officer Mathers had a history, one that had never managed to stick. Complaints filed and dismissed. Witnesses silenced. A paper trail so expertly buried that it might as well have never existed. Until now. There was video evidence. Witnesses who refused to be intimidated, a victim who had barely survived his encounter with Mathers, but was ready to tell this story. And then there was Judge Carter. Unlike the other judges who had let Mathers walk free in the past, she wasn't interested in looking the other way. She had spent her life watching the justice system protect the people it was supposed to hold accountable. She knew this case was bigger than just one officer. It was about all the people who had been wronged and told to move on. It was about a community tired of being ignored. She glanced down at the file in front of her. State of Georgia versus Officer Gregory Mathers. The victim's name, Jalen Wright, a 19-year-old college freshman who had been walking home when Mathers had decided he fit the description. Judge Carter looked up. Officer Mathers, do you understand the charges against you? Mathers folded his arms over his chest. He wore a civilian suit today, but his entire demeanor screamed cop. He was still playing the role of the enforcer, the one in control. Yeah, he said, his voice casual, cocky. I understand. Murmurs rippled through the packed gallery. Families, reporters, community activists. Everyone was watching, waiting. Judge Carter narrowed her eyes. Then we'll proceed. Jalen Wright's parents sat in the front row. His mother, Patrice, clutched a tissue in her hands, knuckles white. His father, Marcus, sat stiffly beside her, jaw tight. They had come to this courtroom too many times before, seen too many officers walk away unscathed. But this time was supposed to be different. The prosecutor, Olivia Grant, stood and smoothed her navy blazer. Your Honor, the prosecution is ready. At the defense table, Mathers' lawyer, Dennis Colton, nodded as well. As is the defense, Your Honor. Judge Carter nodded. Then let's begin. The man in the uniform. The first witness took the stand. An elderly woman named Dorothy Ellis. She lived in the neighborhood where the attack had taken place. The prosecution called her up first because she had seen everything. Dorothy adjusted the microphone in front of her. Her voice was steady, but there was a quiet fury behind her eyes. Tell us what you saw that night, Ms. Ellis, Olivia Grant said. Dorothy exhaled slowly, gathering her words. I was sitting on my porch when I saw the boy, Jalen, walking down the sidewalk. It was late, but he wasn't doing anything wrong. Just had his backpack, walking home. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued. Then the police car pulled up real fast. I saw the officer get out. She pointed at Mathers, her lips pressed into a thin line. Him. Mathers sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. What happened next? Olivia prompted. Dorothy hesitated, then spoke. The officer shouted something at him. Jalen stopped, raised his hands, said he didn't do anything. But the officer didn't care. He slammed the boy against the car so hard I heard the air leave his chest. Then he hit him. A hush fell over the courtroom. Are you saying Officer Mathers struck Mr. Wright, even though he was not resisting? Olivia asked. Yes, Dorothy said firmly. More than once. Judge Carter's gaze flickered toward Mathers. He didn't even flinch. Did Jalen Wright ever attempt to flee? Olivia continued. No, ma'am. That boy didn't move a muscle. Dorothy's voice shook. But that officer kept hitting him. And when Jalen hit the ground, he put his knee on that boy's neck. Right there in the street, just like that other case. She cut herself off, her voice cracking. I thought I was gonna watch that boy die. Jalen Wright sat in his wheelchair near the front of the courtroom, his arm in a sling, his face still healing from the bruises. He lowered his head. Olivia turned back to Dorothy. Did you record any of this? Dorothy nodded. I did. Olivia handed a flash drive to the bailiff. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to present Exhibit A, video evidence of the incident. Judge Carter gave a curt nod. Proceed. A screen lit up at the front of the courtroom. The footage was shaky, recorded from Dorothy's phone, but clear enough to capture every horrifying moment. Jalen on the ground, Mathers on top of him. The sickening sound of fist meeting flesh, the muffled gasps, the heavy silence after. The courtroom was frozen as the video ended. Judge Carter turned to Mathers. Officer Mathers, do you have any response to what we just saw? Mathers exhaled sharply and shook his head, still casual, still unfazed. People see what they want to see. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Judge Carter's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable steel behind her words. This court sees the truth, Officer Mathers, and it will be judged accordingly. She turned to Olivia. Prosecution, call your next witness. The case unfolds. As the trial continued, more witnesses testified. More evidence surfaced. Jalen Wright took the stand, his voice shaking but strong as he recounted the night Mathers nearly took his life. Every testimony was a nail in the coffin. But Mathers wasn't worried. He still believed he was untouchable. He still believed the system would protect him. What he didn't realize, what no one in that courtroom realized, was that this case was about to take a turn no one saw coming. Because Judge Ayanna Carter had spent her entire career preparing for a moment like this, and she was about to show everyone that justice wasn't just an idea. It was an action. And it was coming for Greg Mathers. The illusion of power. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, charged with the weight of history, with the unspoken truths that had lingered in silence for far too long. Officer Greg Mathers sat in his chair, his face unreadable, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had spent years perfecting this act, the look of forced patience, of restrained arrogance. It was the same expression he had worn in every review board hearing, in every meeting with Internal Affairs, in every press conference where he had been cleared of wrongdoing before the ink had dried on the complaints against him. He had always walked away untouched. He expected today to be no different. But today, something was different. Judge Ayanna Carter sat behind the bench, her posture unyielding, her expression neutral but sharp. She had seen officers like Mathers before. She had seen the way they moved through the system, the way the rules bent around them, shielding them, reinforcing their illusion of invincibility. But she also knew something that Mathers did not. Power was never absolute. It only lasted as long as the people allowed it to. And today, the people were watching. The prosecution continued presenting its case, laying out the sequence of events with ruthless precision. They called forensic experts who detailed the extent of Jalen Wright's injuries, the fractured ribs, the concussion, the bruising that mapped out the brutal pattern of excessive force. The medical examiner confirmed that had the assault continued even a minute longer, the injuries could have been fatal. Jalen had been lucky to survive, but luck should never be a factor in whether or not a person survives an encounter with law enforcement. Then came the testimony of another officer, Sergeant Luis Martinez. He had been on duty the night of the incident, arriving at the scene just minutes after the assault had taken place. He took the stand hesitantly, the weight of his decision evident in the way he adjusted his uniform, in the way he cleared his throat before he spoke. It was not easy for a cop to testify against another cop. The blue wall of silence was real, and breaking it came with consequences. Sergeant Martinez, can you describe what you saw when you arrived on the scene? Olivia Grant, the prosecutor, asked as she stepped closer to the witness stand. Martinez exhaled slowly before speaking. I saw Jalen Wright on the ground. He was barely conscious. His face was swollen. His arm looked broken. Officer Mathers was standing over him, adjusting his belt like it was just another day on the job. And did Officer Mathers attempt to provide any medical aid or call for an ambulance? Olivia pressed. Martinez hesitated. No, he admitted. He just stood there. When I asked him what happened, he told me the suspect resisted. But there was no sign of a struggle, no sign that Jalen had been a threat. The only thing I saw was a kid who had been beaten senseless. Mathers' defense attorney, Dennis Colton, stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. Judge Carter met his gaze coolly. Overruled. The witness is describing what he observed. Colton sat down, his jaw tight. Olivia turned back to Martinez. Sergeant, in your professional opinion, did Jalen Wright pose a threat that warranted the level of force used against him? Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No, he was just a kid walking home. The words landed like a blow. The gallery murmured, whispers of frustration and disbelief rippling through the room. Patrice Wright, Jalen's mother, clutched her hands together in her lap, holding back the tears that threatened to spill over. She had known the truth all along. But hearing an officer say it, hearing one of Mathers' own admit that this was wrong, was something she had never expected. Judge Carter studied Mathers carefully. His expression had not changed, but there was something different about his posture now. The smirk was gone. His fingers twitched slightly against the table. For the first time, the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. The prosecution rested their case. Every piece of evidence had been laid bare. Every witness had spoken, and the jury had seen the truth. Now it was time for the defense to present their argument. Dennis Colton stood, straightened his tie, and strode to the center of the courtroom. He turned toward the jury, his expression calm, confident. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, what you have seen today is not justice. It is a carefully constructed attack against a decorated police officer. Officer Mathers has spent 20 years serving this community. He has put his life on the line, faced dangers most of us could never comprehend. And now, because of a few seconds of shaky footage, because of the testimony of people who don't know what it means to be on the front lines, his career is being destroyed. He turned to Martinez. Sergeant, you claim that Jalen Wright was not a threat. Tell me, have you ever been in a situation where a suspect seemed harmless, but then turned violent in an instant? Martinez hesitated. Yes, but nothing, Colton interrupted smoothly. The streets are dangerous. Officers make split-second decisions. We do not have the luxury of reviewing events in slow motion, of playing armchair quarterback in a courtroom. What we have is instinct, and Officer Mathers' instincts told him that something was off that night. He turned to the jury, letting the words settle. This is not a case of excessive force. This is a case of perception, of survival. And I ask you, how many times have we seen these cases before? How many times have good officers been villainized for doing their jobs? Officer Mathers is not on trial today because he broke the law. He is on trial because the court of public opinion has already decided he is guilty. He returned to his seat, satisfied. He had planted the seed of doubt, and in cases like these, that was all it took. Judge Carter exhaled slowly. She had expected this argument. She had seen it before, but this time, she wasn't going to let it dictate the outcome. She turned to Mathers. Officer Mathers, do you wish to take the stand in your own defense? For the first time since the trial had begun, a flicker of hesitation crossed his face. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something in his ear. Mathers' jaw clenched, but then, slowly, he nodded. I'll testify, he said. The courtroom was silent as he stood, and made his way to the witness stand. And as he raised his right hand to take the oath, Judge Carter watched him carefully. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either fall apart or come crashing down around him. She had seen powerful men lie before, but what Mathers didn't realize was that this time, his lies wouldn't save him. The lies we tell. The courtroom was a battlefield now, not of fists or weapons, but of words and truths that had long been suppressed. Officer Greg Mathers adjusted the collar of his suit as he sat in the witness stand. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but he was used to pressure. He had spent 2 decades walking through fire and emerging unscathed, protected by the same system that now threatened to consume him. But he wasn't ready to be swallowed by it. Not yet. His attorney, Dennis Colton, walked toward him with measured steps, his expression one of confidence and control. He had been in this game long enough to know that juries weren't swayed by facts alone. They were swayed by emotion, by perception, by doubt. He needed to paint a different picture of Greg Mathers, one that made the jury second-guess everything they had seen, everything they had heard. Officer Mathers, Colton began, his voice smooth, practiced. You've been with the department for how long? 22 years, Mathers answered, keeping his voice steady. He knew how to play this game, knew how to keep his tone calm, controlled. A victim of circumstance, not a perpetrator of violence. 22 years, Colton repeated, turning to face the jury. That's 2 decades of service. 2 decades of protecting this city. Tell me, Officer Mathers, in those 22 years, have you ever been accused of misconduct? There was a brief silence. Mathers knew the answer mattered, but so did the way he delivered it. He had to give them something, just enough to make himself seem human, fallible, but not guilty. There have been complaints, he admitted, his face unreadable. But when you're a cop, that comes with the job. You make split-second decisions. Not everyone agrees with them. Colton nodded as if that was the most logical response in the world. And have you ever been found guilty of any of those accusations? Mathers glanced at the jury, at the people scrutinizing his every move. Then he turned back to Colton. No, every complaint was investigated and dismissed. Colton turned to the jury again. Investigated and dismissed, because the law, our justice system, found no wrongdoing. But now, today, we're supposed to believe that after 22 years of clean service, suddenly Officer Mathers is a criminal. He let the question hang in the air before pacing slowly. Officer Mathers, walk us through that night. From your perspective. Mathers leaned forward slightly, lacing his fingers together as he spoke. It was late. I was on patrol in an area that has a high crime rate. It's a known hotspot for gang activity, for drug deals, for violence. I saw a young man, Mr. Wright, walking alone, cutting through a back alley. That in itself isn't illegal, but given the time of night, given the history of that area, it was enough to raise suspicion. So you approached him? Colton asked. Yes, Mathers confirmed. I pulled up, exited my vehicle, and asked him to stop. And did he? Mathers nodded. At first, yes, but there was something in his body language, something that made me cautious. He looked like he was about to run. Colton turned to the jury. A trained officer with decades of experience reads a suspect's body language. He assesses a potential threat before it escalates. Officer Mathers, what happened next? Mathers exhaled as if recalling a traumatic memory. I told him to put his hands up. He hesitated. I repeated the command, and that's when he started lowering one of his hands toward his pocket. In this line of work, that's an immediate red flag. I had no way of knowing if he was reaching for a weapon, for drugs, for something that could harm me. So I reacted. And your reaction? Colton prompted. Mathers straightened his shoulders. I took him to the ground to neutralize the potential threat. Standard procedure. Colton nodded, satisfied. No further questions. The prosecution's table was silent. Olivia Grant sat unmoving for a moment before she stood, smoothing the front of her blazer. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes, something dangerous. She walked toward the stand, stopping only when she was close enough to look Mathers in the eye. "Officer Mathers," she began, her tone measured. "You say Jalen Wright's body language indicated he was going to run. Did he actually run?" Mathers hesitated for a fraction of a second. "No." "You say he lowered his hand toward his pocket. Did you see a weapon?" "No," Mathers admitted, his jaw tightening. "Did you see any object in his hand at all?" Olivia pressed. Mathers' fingers curled slightly against the wood of the stand. Olivia nodded as if she had expected that answer. "So let me make sure I understand. A 19-year-old college student, walking home, did not run, did not brandish a weapon, did not make a verbal threat, and yet you slammed him to the ground with enough force to fracture his ribs and cause a concussion." Mathers' face remained neutral, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "I reacted to the situation as it unfolded." "You reacted," Olivia repeated. "Would you say you overreacted?" "No," Mathers said immediately. Olivia turned toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. "Let's watch the footage again." The video played, and for the first time, Mathers had to sit there, in front of the jury, in front of the entire courtroom, and watch himself attack Jalen Wright. The room was silent except for the sounds of the recording. Jalen's voice saying he wasn't doing anything wrong, the sharp bark of Mathers' command, the sickening impact of body meeting pavement. When the footage ended, Olivia turned back to Mathers. "Officer Mathers, where in that video do you see Jalen reaching for a weapon?" Mathers didn't answer. "Where in that video do you see him making an aggressive move toward you?" Silence. "Where in that video do you see anything that justifies what you did?" Mathers' fingers curled into fists. "You weren't there," he said finally, his voice low, controlled. "You don't know what it's like in that moment." "But we do know what happened after that moment," Olivia countered. "You kept hitting him, kept restraining him even when he stopped moving. Tell me, Officer Mathers, when exactly did Jalen Wright stop being a threat?" Mathers' face darkened. "When I decided he was." And just like that, the truth slipped through. The courtroom rippled with the weight of his words. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable, but her gaze locked onto Mathers like a blade. He had spent his career manipulating the system, bending it in his favor, but arrogance had always been the downfall of men like him. He had just admitted, before a judge, before a jury, that his power to decide who was a threat had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with his own perception. "Nothing further, Your Honor," Olivia said, stepping back. Judge Carter exhaled slowly. She knew what had just happened. The jury knew. And for the first time since this trial began, Greg Mathers looked uncertain. He had spent his life being untouchable. But today, he was finally within reach. And the law was closing in. The fall of the untouchable. Judge Ayanna Carter's courtroom was no longer just a space for legal proceedings. It was a battlefield where truth and power clashed. The walls that had protected Officer Greg Mathers for decades were beginning to crack, and for the first time in his career, he was the one fighting to stay in control. The jury had seen the footage. They had heard his own words betray him. And now, as he sat in the witness stand, he could feel the tide turning against him. Mathers had always believed in his own invincibility. He had been through this before. Complaints, lawsuits, disciplinary hearings, all of them conveniently brushed aside. He had been suspended a few times, sure, but never in any way that truly mattered. He had connections. He had people in the department who protected him. He had a badge that, up until now, had always kept him untouchable. But that illusion was unraveling, thread by thread. Judge Carter turned her gaze toward the defense table, her expression calm but firm. "Mr. Colton, do you wish to redirect?" Dennis Colton, Mathers' attorney, stood slowly, straightening his suit jacket before walking toward the witness stand. He knew the damage had been done. Mathers' arrogance had cost them, but there was still time to pivot, to sow doubt in the minds of the jury. All he needed was one juror to hesitate, to question whether they could truly convict a police officer for doing his job. "Officer Mathers," Colton said, his voice smooth, rehearsed, "you just stated that you reacted based on your training and experience. In your 2 decades of service, how many times have you been in life-threatening situations?" Mathers exhaled, trying to regain his composure. "Too many to count." "Have you ever had a suspect pull a weapon on you before?" Colton asked. "Yes." "Have you ever been attacked while on duty?" "Yes," Mathers said, nodding. "Multiple times." Colton turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, how many of us have had to make split-second decisions where our lives were at stake? How many of us have had to determine in a fraction of a second whether we would go home to our families or end up in a hospital, or worse, a casket?" He paced slowly, letting the words sink in. Officer Mathers did not wake up that morning intending to harm anyone. He was doing his job, protecting his community. And now, because of one decision, one moment captured on shaky video, he is being painted as a monster. I ask you, does that seem fair? A few members of the jury shifted in their seats. The doubt was creeping in, just as Colton had planned. "Officer Mathers," Colton continued, "if you could go back to that night, would you do anything differently?" Mathers hesitated. He had to be careful now. Too much remorse, and he would look guilty. Too little, and he would reinforce the image of himself as a brute. "I would have asked for backup sooner," he said finally. "Maybe then things wouldn't have escalated." Colton nodded approvingly. No further questions. Mathers exhaled, feeling a sliver of relief as Colton returned to his seat. Maybe he had managed to salvage something. But then Olivia Grant stood again. "Your Honor," she said, "the prosecution has one final question." Judge Carter nodded. "Proceed." Olivia walked slowly toward the witness stand, her hands clasped in front of her. "Officer Mathers," she said, her voice quieter now, almost gentle. "You said you made a split-second decision, that you acted based on your training." Mathers nodded. "That's right." "You said you've been in life-threatening situations before," Olivia continued. "But was Jalen Wright threatening your life?" Mathers opened his mouth, but Olivia didn't give him the chance to answer. "Was he holding a weapon?" she pressed. "Did he lunge at you? Did he attempt to harm you in any way?" Mathers' jaw clenched. "No." "So why did you keep hitting him?" Olivia's voice remained calm, but her eyes were locked onto him. "After he was on the ground, after he stopped moving, why did you keep going?" Mathers' lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thick and suffocating. And then Olivia delivered the final blow. "Was it because you could?" Mathers' face twitched. His hands clenched against the armrests of his chair, and for the first time, the mask slipped. The arrogance, the control, it all cracked under the weight of that single question. Because the truth was, it had never been about fear. It had never been about self-defense. It had been about power. His power. And now, that power was slipping from his grasp. Olivia let the silence linger before turning to Judge Carter. "No further questions, Your Honor." Mathers sat there, his pulse pounding in his ears, his mind racing. He needed to fix this. He needed to say something, do something. But before he could react, Judge Carter spoke. "Officer Mathers," she said, her voice firm, final. "You may step down." He swallowed hard before rising from the stand, his movements stiff, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He returned to his seat beside Colton, but the damage was done. The jury had seen it. The cracks in his armor. The truth behind the badge. And he knew, deep down, that he wasn't walking away from this one. The unraveling of a legacy. As the trial neared its end, the tension in the courtroom only grew thicker. The defense and prosecution delivered their closing arguments, each side fighting for control over the narrative. The prosecution painted Mathers as a man who had abused his power, who had brutalized an innocent young man simply because he could. The defense, desperate to regain ground, argued that this was a case of misunderstanding, of a good cop being punished for doing his job in an unforgiving world. But it wasn't just about Mathers anymore. It was about every officer who had walked free after excessive force. It was about every family who had sat in a courtroom, praying for justice they never received. It was about a system that had allowed this to happen over and over again. And Judge Carter knew it. She sat behind the bench, watching as the final words were spoken, as the jury was sent to deliberate. She had seen many cases in her career, had presided over trials that tested the very fabric of the law. But this one was different. Because this time, the system was being forced to answer for itself. Hours passed. The courtroom remained full, no one daring to leave, no one willing to miss what was coming. And then, finally, the jury returned. The foreman, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, stood as Judge Carter addressed him. Has the jury reached a verdict? He nodded once. We have, Your Honor. A beat of silence. Judge Carter nodded. Proceed. The courtroom held its breath as the foreman unfolded the paper in his hands. He cleared his throat, his voice steady. In the case of State of Georgia versus Officer Gregory Mathers, on the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp swept through the room. Mathers' entire body went rigid. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The foreman continued. On the charge of misconduct in office, we find the defendant guilty. A sharp exhale came from Patrice Wright, Jalen's mother, as tears streamed down her face. Jalen closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking with the weight of the moment. Mathers gripped the table, his face pale, his jaw locked so tight it looked painful. Judge Carter let the verdict settle before speaking. Officer Mathers, you have been found guilty on all charges. Sentencing will take place at a later date. She turned to the bailiffs. Take him into custody. The room erupted. Mathers jolted as two uniformed officers approached him. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Carter's gaze didn't waver. Yes, Officer Mathers, it is. As the cuffs snapped around his wrists, the illusion of his power crumbled. And for the first time in his life, Greg Mathers was just another man. Another criminal. Another name in the system. And justice, true justice, had finally arrived. The consequence of power. The courtroom remained thick with emotion long after the verdict was read. The gasps, the murmurs, the quiet sobs of relief from Jalen Wright's family, all of it echoed in the walls, an undeniable testament to what had just happened. Officer Greg Mathers had spent his career believing himself untouchable. But today, he was just another convicted man being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. As the bailiffs guided Mathers toward the side exit, his face was twisted in barely contained rage. His jaw was locked, his fists clenched so tightly in his cuffs that his knuckles had turned white. He refused to look at the spectators. He refused to meet the gazes of the jurors who had condemned him, the press who were already preparing their headlines, or the victim whose life he had nearly destroyed. Mathers had spent decades walking into courtrooms with his badge polished, his uniform crisp, his presence a symbol of authority. But now, as he shuffled forward, wrists bound, his suit wrinkled from hours of sitting, he looked no different than the countless men he had arrested over the years. And for the first time, reality was settling in. There was no special treatment coming. There was no lifeline waiting. He wasn't walking out of this one. Judge Ayanna Carter remained seated, watching as Mathers was taken away. Her face was unreadable, but her hands, resting on the bench before her, were steady. She had known what this case would mean, not just for the city, but for the justice system itself. This wasn't just about one man. This was about every officer who had ever hidden behind their badge, every victim who had been denied justice, every time the system had failed to protect the people it was meant to serve. Jalen Wright sat in his wheelchair, his eyes locked on Mathers' retreating figure. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel. Relief. Satisfaction. Closure. The pain in his ribs was still fresh, the trauma still a heavy weight on his shoulders. But as he watched Mathers disappear through the doors, something shifted inside him. He had been told, over and over again, that men like Mathers always walked free. That justice wasn't meant for people like him. And yet, today, justice had arrived. Patrice Wright, Jalen's mother, let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She reached for her son's hand, squeezing it gently. "It's over," she whispered, though the tears in her eyes betrayed the years of fear and helplessness that had come before this moment. Jalen nodded, but he wasn't sure if it was truly over. The trial had ended, the verdict had been delivered, but the scars remained. He had spent weeks in a hospital bed, recovering from injuries that never should have happened. He had spent nights awake, reliving the moment Mathers had thrown him to the ground, fists slamming into his ribs, his breath stolen from him. He had spent hours wondering if he would even get his day in court, if people would believe him. And now, even with Mathers convicted, Jalen knew that healing wasn't as simple as a guilty verdict, but it was a start. Judge Carter cleared her throat, bringing the room back to order. "Court is adjourned," she announced, striking her gavel one final time. The sound echoed through the room, definitive and final. The system reacts. Outside the courthouse, the world was waiting. Reporters clustered on the steps, cameras flashing, microphones poised to capture the reactions of the prosecution, the defense, and the Wright family. The city had been following this case closely, more closely than any trial in recent memory. Protests had erupted in the weeks leading up to the trial, people demanding accountability, demanding change. And now, the streets were alive with celebration and anger alike. Some saw this as justice, others saw it as betrayal. The police union released a statement within the hour, calling the verdict a dangerous precedent, and warning that officers would now hesitate to do their jobs for fear of being prosecuted. Social media was a battleground. Some praised the jury's decision. Others decried it as a political hit job against law enforcement. Within the department, officers were divided. Some, like Sergeant Luis Martinez, saw this as a necessary reckoning, a sign that the badge could no longer be a shield against justice. Others saw it as a warning shot, proof that the courts were now turning against them. Whispers spread through the precincts, calls for walkouts, refusals to engage with high-crime areas, a collective resentment brewing. But no matter the reaction, one thing was clear. Something had changed. The fall of a giant. Greg Mathers sat in a holding cell, staring at the wall. He had been in places like this before, but always on the other side of the bars. He had arrested hundreds of men, booked them into cells just like this one. He had always believed himself to be different from them, better. He had convinced himself that he was the enforcer of the law, not subject to it. But now, as he sat in his wrinkled suit, his hands still marked by the pressure of the cuffs, the weight of his situation pressed down on him like a vice. His mind raced through every possible escape, every connection he could call in, every favor he could cash in. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no out this time. No one was coming to save him. He had seen officers get away with worse, but this trial had been different. The cameras had been on him from the beginning. The people had been watching. There was no way to sweep this under the rug. He clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath his skin. How had it come to this? He had done his job. He had followed his instincts. That kid had looked suspicious. He had done what any cop would have done, hadn't he? But even as he thought it, something else gnawed at him. A whisper of doubt, a sliver of truth that he had buried for years. He hadn't reacted out of fear that night. He had reacted because he could, because he had always been able to, because no one had ever stopped him before. Now, finally, someone had. The reality of prison loomed over him. He knew what happened to cops on the inside. He had seen it before, the way officers convicted of crimes were marked men the moment they stepped into the yard. The same system that had once protected him would now be his greatest threat. He exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't broken. Not yet. But the cracks were there. And for the first time in his life, Greg Mathers was afraid. The road ahead. Jalen Wright sat in the back of his family's car as they drove home from the courthouse. The city lights blurred past the window, neon reflections stretching across the wet pavement. He wasn't sure what came next. The trial was over, but his life was still changed forever. He had once been just a college student, worrying about exams and late-night study sessions. Now he was a symbol, a name attached to a case that had shaken the city. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to live. Patrice reached over, squeezing his hand. "You did it," she whispered. Jalen nodded, but he wasn't sure if he had done anything. He had survived. That was all. As the car turned down their street, he let out a quiet breath. Maybe that was enough. For now. Justice, but not the end. The conviction of Greg Mathers sent ripples through the city, through the country. Some saw it as progress. Others saw it as a warning. But no matter how it was interpreted, one thing was certain. For the first time, a man who had hidden behind his badge had been forced to answer for his actions. For the first time, justice had not been a distant dream. For the first time, the untouchable had been touched. But this was just one case. One man. One verdict. The fight wasn't over. It never was. The beginning of a new era. The days following the conviction of Greg Mathers were unlike anything the city had seen before. The headlines spread like wildfire across the nation. News anchors dissected every second of the trial. Social media exploded with debates, and in the streets, people either celebrated or seethed, depending on which side of the verdict they stood. For Jalen Wright, the noise was deafening. His name was everywhere. Talk show panels, newspaper headlines, protest signs, even on the lips of strangers who whispered as he passed by. Some called him a symbol of justice, a young man who had fought the system and won. Others called him a liar, a pawn in a political game meant to tear down the police. He didn't ask for any of this. He had never wanted to be anyone's symbol. All he had wanted was to go home that night. Now home didn't feel the same. The bruises on his body had begun to heal, but the wounds inside him lingered. The nights were the worst. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. Flashing lights, heavy footsteps, the weight of a body pressing him down, fists raining down on him, his own voice begging for breath. He had spent months telling himself he was lucky to be alive, but some nights, survival felt like another punishment. Patrice Wright, his mother, watched him closely. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged, the way he flinched when voices rose too loudly around him. She had spent nights sitting outside his bedroom door, listening for any signs of another nightmare. He barely spoke about what happened anymore, not because he didn't remember, but because he couldn't escape it. "You know you don't have to be strong all the time," she told him one evening as they sat on their porch, the city's hum buzzing in the distance. Jalen shrugged, staring out into the night. "I don't think I know how to be anything else." She reached for his hand, gripping it firmly. "You fought for something bigger than yourself, baby. That kind of fight takes a toll. You need to give yourself permission to heal." Jalen sighed. He knew she was right, but healing wasn't as simple as people made it sound. How did you heal from something that changed everything? How did you move forward when every part of you was still living in the past, inside the system that created him? Greg Mathers sat alone in his prison cell, staring at the dull gray walls. He had been transferred to a special holding unit, away from the general population. Cops didn't survive in general population, and as much as he hated to admit it, he knew he wouldn't be an exception. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, but now, stripped of his uniform, his badge, his authority, he was just another prisoner. The walls around him weren't just made of concrete and metal. They were built from every decision he had ever made, every time he had crossed the line and gotten away with it. The weight of those choices pressed down on him now, heavier than the walls themselves. His lawyer had filed an appeal within hours of the verdict, but Mathers knew better. The evidence was too damning, the public pressure too intense. This wasn't just about him. It was about an entire system that had protected men like him for too long. This time, the system had turned on him. And he knew, deep down, that he would never be free again. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be powerless. The irony wasn't lost on him. A city divided. Outside the courthouse, the city was still at war with itself. Some saw Mathers' conviction as the dawn of a new era, a long overdue reckoning for law enforcement. Others saw it as an attack on the men and women who wore the badge, an attempt to vilify those who had sworn to protect and serve. The police union was in an uproar. Officers staged walkouts in protest, refusing to patrol certain areas, claiming they no longer felt supported. Conservative pundits on television warned of an impending crime wave, blaming the verdict for what they called a war on police. But in communities that had long been ignored, there was a different kind of conversation happening. For the first time, people dared to hope. For years, the idea of an officer being held accountable had seemed impossible. They had seen the stories before, the names of the victims scrawled across protest signs, the marches, the demands for justice that were always met with silence. But this time, the silence had been broken. The question now was whether this was the beginning of something new or just a temporary anomaly. The weight of a decision. Judge Ayanna Carter sat in her office long after the trial had ended, staring at the case files still spread across her desk. The gavel she had slammed down in the courtroom sat beside them, a symbol of the justice she had tried to uphold. She had known this case would come with consequences, but she had underestimated the extent of them. Hate mail flooded her inbox. Threats arrived at her office, her home. Armed protesters stood outside the courthouse some nights, demanding her resignation, calling her corrupt, biased, unfit to sit on the bench. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, but now she was the one being put on trial in the court of public opinion. She sighed, rubbing her temples. She had no regrets. This case had never been about revenge. It had never been about politics. It had been about accountability, about proving that the law applied to everyone, even those who once believed themselves above it. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her father. Proud of you. The right thing is never easy. Love you. She exhaled, a small smile touching her lips. No, it was never easy. But it was always worth it. Moving forward, Jalen stood at the entrance of a community center, staring at the door in front of him. Inside, a group of young men and women had gathered for a discussion about police reform, about what came next. He had been invited as a guest speaker, but he wasn't sure if he was ready. He had spent so long trying to put distance between himself and what had happened. Speaking about it felt like ripping open a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. But as he turned to leave, he caught sight of his reflection in the glass door. He saw himself, not just as a victim, but as someone who had survived, as someone who had the power to change the conversation. Maybe he wasn't ready, but maybe he never would be. And maybe that was okay. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The fight wasn't over. But neither was he. The legacy of a verdict. The trial of Greg Mathers would be remembered for years to come. Some would see it as a victory for justice, others as a betrayal of law enforcement. The city would change, for better or worse, shaped by the conversations that followed. But beyond the headlines, beyond the debates, beyond the politics, there was one undeniable truth. For the first time in a long time, a man who had wielded power without consequence had finally been forced to answer for his actions. For the first time, the system had worked, however imperfectly. For the first time, justice had not been a distant dream. And for those who had spent their lives waiting for that day, it was enough. For now. Because the fight was never truly over. But this time, they weren't fighting alone.